Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform. Hello everyone, welcome to our latest episode of Conflict Stories. I'm Sam Hardy and I'm joining you today from Peramunk and Kaurna country in the Adelaide Hills, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the ongoing connection and custodianship of the land on which I am joining you from today.
And I'm in Byron, and it's the Bundjalung people who've been on these lands for 22,000 plus years. And what about you, Debbie? Where are you joining us from today?
Oh, yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm joining you from Nabina, where the Palawa people are the original owners.
And Nabina is the Indigenous word for crayfish. Do you have a lot of crayfish around where you live, Debbie?
Yeah, but I think they're all exported.
We are delighted to have Debbie joining us today. Even though she has a Scottish accent, she is now living in Australia and has been for many years. Debbie Dunn is her full name. She's a narrative practitioner and accredited AMDRAS mediator based in Tasmania. She runs a narrative practice, drawing on more than 2 decades of experience across mediation, therapy, human resource leadership, and social justice. Debbie works in areas including workplace bullying, institutional accountability, and restorative practices, all grounded in deep empathy and a strong narrative technique. She also teaches the Narrative Mediation Essentials course at the Conflict Management Academy, which is one of the only narrative mediation courses now available in the world, I think. She's got a graduate diploma in narrative therapy from the Dulwich Centre in Adelaide, and she's led support groups for workplace bullying survivors and helped pioneer narrative mediation in Australia. We'll be talking a little bit about some of Debbie's personal experiences in her early career in the UK Women's Air Force as well.
Yes, well, welcome, Debbie. Thanks for joining us. And we generally start with, I guess, your childhood your upbringing in terms of what conflict was like in your family, if you're happy to share.
What was conflict like in my family? Well, of course, the traditional family, living with mum and dad. We lived above the pub that my parents owned and ran. I have a sister who's 5 years younger, and most of the conflict was between my sister and I. Being the older sister, I was often asked to look after her, which was not something I really wanted to do, especially as got to teenage years. But I found it easy to get my sister to, I guess, show some anger and throw things at me. It seemed to be her way of dealing with conflict, whereas I learned just to run away rather quickly.
And what about the pub downstairs? Did you hear much conflict from that?
No. As far as I know, I'm sure there was some. I'm sure Dad would have thrown people out if they'd, not done the right thing. But the door at the bottom of the stairs leading into the pub was always locked.
And Debbie, running away might have been your childhood instinct, but now you run towards conflict in that it's your business, so to speak. And you have an approach to managing conflict that's a little bit different to the norm in Australia. You use narrative mediation and narrative techniques. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to that approach and how it differs from the standard facilitative mediation approach that's used commonly in Australia.
Yeah, sure. When I moved to Adelaide, I'd left P&O Containers in Sydney, where I worked for, 17 years, and was looking for something different, and saw this week-long course being advertised where it looked at all different forms of therapeutic practice. And the only one that stood out for me was a woman by a similar name to me, Deborah, who spoke about narrative therapy. As I say, that was the only one that connected with me. So what then I did was to speak with her and ask her where one could find out more. And she directed me to the Dulwich Centre in Adelaide. I did two 1-week intensives. One was kind of an introduction, and then the other one was the one that followed that. And then I decided I really was so interested in it, I signed up to do 2 years. So
Oh,
gave up working and became a student for 2 years.
oh, wow, that's quite a commitment. And I'm quite keen to understand too, because I'm a facilitative mediator, which I think that's probably the majority of people practice in that way. I know a little bit about narrative, but what would you say the main differences are between those two forms of or practices of mediation?
Yeah. I think the main one initially is the idea that identity is socially constructed. And so it looks at the various social constructs or discourses that inform and shape how we see ourselves in the world. Certainly, I guess, like facilitative, I imagine it sees people as the experts in their own lives, which is one of the underpinning philosophies of narrative. It looks more at how together can people solve the problems or the conflicts that are getting in the way of how their preferred way of working or their preferred relationship of one another. And it becomes more collaborative. So it's actually going into the stories and the meaning making that people give to certain situations. So these get unpacked and the history is then traced. There's usually an event that gets in the way of the relationship that people hold with one another. And it's tracing that history and making meaning out of it for each person, if we were looking at two people, so that they get a different understanding of what informs and shapes the person they've been in conflict with. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
No, that's good. And I assume within that, there's a lot of assumptions made, and a lot of that is clarified during that process?
yeah, absolutely. I
Mm.
often talk about assumption making being, I guess, one of the biggest things that gets in the way of people's relationships.
Yeah.
And certainly when I'm doing training or working with people that want to understand more about the other, is to put assumption making aside and bring in more curiosity to find out, why people say or do things.
Mm. And Debbie, I know from that work, in your work in narrative therapy and in narrative mediation, you ended up becoming a little bit of a specialist in working with people who were experiencing workplace bullying. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit
Mm.
about how that developed in your practice.
Yeah, sure. That again was in Adelaide. I set up a therapy practice and a mediation practice in Adelaide, and somebody came to see me for therapy and talked about how they'd been bullied in the workplace. And so I did some work with them. I then got in touch with the workplace ombudsman at the time to find out more about workplace bullying, because it was certainly something I didn't know terribly much about. Having worked with one person and going to the workplace ombudsman, I then found other people were contacting me for therapy around the same thing. Out of that came the creation of the Bullied Workers Support Action Network. And they used my offices every weekend to meet and to talk about it. And I facilitated the conversations and trying to move them away from that notion of being victims to taking action against the practices of bullying. Out of that came $20,000 of funding, which we then developed, wrote a play, which we showed at the Adelaide Fringe, and then got some further funding. And many of the people who were in the group actually became consultants to different organizations about setting up support groups within organizations. So that was my history. It was hearing the stories of bullying and then wondering why mediation wasn't, I guess, seen as an okay thing to do when bullying got in the way. One of the other things I did before the Resolution Institute became RI, when it was leader, I was the chair of the local leader group, South Australian group. And a woman called Dale Bagshaw and I did a professional development session, And what we did is we invited members of the Bullied Workers Support Action Network to tell us about what would have worked for them if mediation had been possible. And without exception, they were really clear that they would have loved to have been able to sit down across the table from the person they alleged had used bullying against them, to be able to talk about what was going on and to sort it out. So that was
Mm.
really how it kicked off.
So I'm interested in that, Debbie, in terms of did you actually do any mediations between two parties where there was accusations of bullying?
Yeah, I guess over time, particularly in those days, I probably had done about 400 before I moved to Tassie, around about that number, and all with, well, successful, I guess, if you have to uh, pin that kind of social construct on an outcome,
Yeah.
where the relationships were restored in some fashion or another. But what I certainly found was that, one, the intentions where we think that there is an intention to bully or to do harm, that was one of the myths, as I call them, that got debunked along the way.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you read the definitions of bullying and you look at the workplace health and safety legislation, whilst it doesn't have to be intent, there was certainly a belief that it was intentional to do harm. And out of the mediations, it became really clear after several, at least the ones I was involved in mediating, that in fact there was no intent to do harm, that something had happened along the way that meant that people took up a different position in relation to each other than they had before the event. So it could have been somebody challenging somebody at a meeting, or there was assumption making that said that they were out to get rid of somebody. So there was always another story. And what mediation does, I believe, is make it possible for each to hear the other. Because certainly, if you look at the history of workplace bullying, it's been developed and whole industry set up. It's been developed on the basis of the voices of those who've alleged they've been bullied, and the voices of those that have alleged to have used bullying practices never got heard. And so I think
Mm.
mediation made that possible.
I'm interested in with that, Debbie, like I know, well, my understanding is I do a lot of workplace conflict, haven't generally done much with bullying
Mm.
accusations because I think I always want them to do an investigation before we go down that track to make sure whether it's assessed as bullying or not. I think a couple of things. One is about taking responsibility and how hard that is when you've been accused of something like bullying or harassment or discrimination. Also, I think it's interesting because when I think of bullying, so I did a bit of restorative practice with juvenile justice. And, that's when a young person had committed a crime. And, we take them through that sort of restorative practice, which is really about understanding the impact and repairing the harm. And I'm wondering when you do the bullying ones, is it more about restoring harm or is it about resolving conflict? And I guess that's how I see the difference between the two. Just
Yeah,
interested in your thoughts on that.
yeah. Uh, what came out of the mediations I've done is that there was harm on both sides,
Mm,
and neither had understood that. So restoring the relationship, once that was acknowledged and voiced, it was easy to move to a place of collaboration and to put things in place. And that's one of the things that we think of in bullying, that one person is out to harm another. But do we ever ask the question, what if it's not?
I also hear you're very clear in your distinction with the language that you're using, that you talk about people who engage in bullying behaviours, not people who are bullies.
Yeah. I think the totalizing is really unhelpful, as with anything, because there are many layers to people's lives. We are multi-storied. So how do we find out what those other layers are if we've totalized them and named them as a bully? whatever's been going on as an expression of something. And as mediators, I think it's our role to find out what it was that happened that got them acting in a particular way. Whether it's a manager excluding somebody from meetings, let's find out the reason, because there will be a history to it. People don't do things for no good reason.
And how do you find that sort of balance, I guess, too? Like, there are often reasons and circumstances, balancing that with taking responsibility and not finding excuses all the time for behavior as well. How did you balance those two aspects?
I think inviting responsibility is one of the underpinning important aspects of narrative mediation. But if you think that somebody does something and somebody takes a position in relation to what's happened and then starts to behave towards that person in a different way, then often both have some responsibility around what's happened. And narrative mediation opens up and creates that space that makes that possible for people to hear both stories and the history of it. And I'm thinking too of often I remember one where a manager cried because that she had no idea at all the harm she'd done, but then explained why, but also took responsibility and apologized to the team member that was part of the mediation. And then we held a meeting with the whole of the team and the manager where everybody had an opportunity to speak about the impact. Because one of the other important, if you like, aspects of narrative is that we talk about the effects of something. If we don't talk about the effects and understand the impact of something, then it's very difficult, I find, for people to move to a different place.
And I heard you say that often the person who had been accused of engaging in bullying behaviour didn't necessarily intend to harm the person that they were behaving in that way towards. And yet there was a negative impact. And so you're facilitating a conversation about what was their intention, what was the story behind this behaviour, and then giving the other person the chance to talk about the impact on them, and then the person taking responsibility, even though that wasn't what I intended. I'm sorry that my behaviour had that impact on you. And then they can rebuild a relationship of trust, hopefully, and communication.
Yeah. Because if we don't move away from blame, people will never be honest in terms of how they position themselves or what they say or what they will take responsibility from.
Mm.
So certainly narrative too is a non-blaming approach to whether it's therapeutic work or mediation work.
Because that's what I see in conflict a lot. Both parties will come in blaming each other, won't they? And how do you shift that? How do you open it up where they're not pointing the finger and taking some ownership or responsibility to make those changes as well, which is one of the challenges, I think, as a mediator.
I think so. Narrative, certainly, there's a lot more work up front before we bring people together. So the individual meeting is way beyond an intake session in facilitative or other forms of mediation. The individual meeting gives the person an opportunity to talk about what's happened and ask questions about the effects. But I'm also interested in the discourses operating, i.e., what are the social constructs that have got them thinking the way they do? And also, I guess, challenging some of those taken for granted truths that they hold. So, where did you get the idea they were out to exclude you? Because then the problem can become assumption making rather than the actual act of bullying that they might have described. And so the naming of the problem often changes at that point before we even get into the joint meeting.
I like the narrative technique of externalizing. So literally almost separating the problem from the person. So talking about when did the blaming start, not when did he start doing something blameworthy, or when did the anger turn up rather than when did you get angry and what impact did that cause?
Yeah. Yeah, because I would ask what brought the anger, for example, because if people talk about being bullied, I really want to know what was it that happened that's got them naming that? Well, I was part of meetings and then suddenly I was excluded from them. And that's a practice, of course, that comes under the definition of bullying. And then talking about not about the bullying, but the exclusion is that idea of externalizing. And when you do that, it means that people can actually look at the problem in a different way. And that's the thing that moves you away from blame because it's not being
Right.
internalized.
It's like when parties say, "Well, it's their personality that I've got a problem with." It's like, "Wait a second. Let's get a little bit more specific on that."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me more about the
Yeah,
personality and, what is it that you think, is the problem? Yeah.
yeah. Then we've got something to work with.
Debbie, I wonder if we could go back in time a little bit before you worked at P&O Containers and before you became a narrative therapist and narrative mediator. I know you started out life as a physical
Mhm.
training instructor in the UK Women's Air Force, and there's quite a traumatic story attached to that that has suddenly become current for you again. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I was trying to remember all the dates the other day without, showing how incredibly old I am. I think it was in 1970 that I joined the Women's Royal Air Force. I left school in 69, wanted to go to PE college, but because I'd played so much sport and had too much fun, I didn't have the qualifications. So I joined the Women's Royal Air Force and applied to be a physical training instructor and was doing that, as far as I know, quite successfully. I represented the Women's Royal Air Force and combined services in athletics, in netball, in hockey, and was well known, if you like, in sporting fields in the combined services in the Women's Royal Air Force. And after, I think I'd been there about 2 years and I was stationed, I won't say where I was stationed, but I was running sporting events across one of the commands. I was an advisor to the person who was running Air Support Command at the time. And then suddenly I was invited, well, I don't know if I was invited, I was told that there was 2 MPs, that's the military police, who wished to talk to me. This started off in kinda late afternoon, early evening, and I was then interrogated for something like the next 12 hours about a relationship I allegedly had with another woman some time ago before that. Not somebody who was on the same station, but who was in another station. At the end of that, and I call it an interrogation, I hadn't had dinner, no sleep, in a room with 2 people I didn't know. And at the end of that, in the morning, I was told that I should report to admin, go and pack my bags first, and that I would be leaving the Air Force straight away, basically. And the reason it's come up, and I've written it down so I get the words right, but there's a veterans of the LGBT bar. In other words, it's been languaged in a way that says you were banned because you were a member of the LGBT. And that's in UK. I know we've got a few more letters over here. And it's a financial recognition scheme of the damage that's been done. So, yeah, so it was really quite bizarre. A friend who also got kicked out at the same time contacted me and said, "Did you know about this scheme?" Which, of course, I had no idea. I hadn't even thought of the Air Force in a very long time. So that was not an event I would like to repeat.
So just to clarify, Debbie, so you'd had a relationship with another woman, and then somehow the police found out, and then you had 12 hours of interrogation, and then you were kicked out.
Yep,
And then
that's
I can imagine that was quite a shock.
oh well, I was yeah, destroyed, and it felt
Mm.
like my world had come to an end, and I had nowhere to go. It was They gave you a train ticket and any money that they owed you, and that was it. A train ticket to London.
Debbie, what was the culture like around gender and sexuality and relationships in the armed forces at that time? Was this something that you saw coming, or was it completely out of the blue?
Um, I knew that one was not supposed to engage in sexual relations with the same gender. My understanding at the time was that you could be blackmailed. I mean, I was a physical training instructor, but, who knows? So it was, to me, a bit of a twist. If it had been okay to have sexual relations with someone of the same gender, you wouldn't have been blackmail material.
Oh, so they thought that you would have been a risk to the armed forces because someone could blackmail you on the basis that they
Yeah,
would disclose your homosexuality or something like that.
yeah, yeah. So that was the reason it was a no-no, if you like. So and there was a lot of it going on. It's not like I was the only person in the Weapons Royal Air Force. And so the culture was one of secrecy.
And I think we've chatted about this before, and you said that you denied this all the way through the investigation, and there wasn't evidence
Yeah,
as such. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be a target for the military police.
yeah. Well, I'd been dobbed in basically by someone I'd had a brief fling with, who I thought was a very good friend. I've never spoken to her since, by the way. She didn't make contact. But my understanding is that she was having a relationship with an officer, and somebody had found out that was happening, and she was investigated. And during the investigation, gave up my name. And so she too was dishonourably discharged. But there was a whole stream of other people at the same time. So whether it was, I'm not sure how all that came, if it was from the same source or they were just following all the links about who went to London on weekends with Debbie Dunn, for example, and went to, the clubs in London. I've no idea how all of that happened, but I was dobbed in. And I did deny, and but didn't make any difference. They obviously had this other woman's word and took that as truth. And it was true, but I wasn't going to own up.
So what was the impact of that on you, Debbie, in terms of being, you're off on the train to London and you got nothing, and then what's been the impact since then? And obviously, what is it? Almost how many years later? Is it almost 50 years later?
Yeah, a lot of years later.
A long
Thank you,
time
Scott. Yeah,
later.
And you'd probably put it out of your mind, but now it's suddenly right back in your mind because of this redress scheme.
yeah. The first word that comes to mind when I was thinking about this was shame and humiliation. Because everyone who I was friends with on the station I was in knew, because, word gets around pretty quickly. So they all knew. I know that when I was in the admin office, and because I was so tired and had no idea what the hell was going on or why, because it was really confusing, because if you haven't had sleep and nothing to eat, that I fainted while they were doing all my paperwork and stuff. So then, the nurse was called in, and yeah, so word quickly spread, but certainly shame and humiliation at that point, and wondering what in heaven's name I was going to do. And what do I tell my parents?
Debbie, was the shame and humiliation about being discharged, or was it about being outed as having had a relationship with a woman? Because I imagine a lot of your friendship circle would have known that anyway.
It was about being dishonourably discharged for something that I didn't think one should be punished for.
So what happened from there, Debbie? How did you pull your life together after that very big shock?
When I got to London, I had the number of a couple of women that I'd done my basic training in the Women's Royal Air Force with, who had been dishonourably discharged several months prior to that. And of course, they came and met me at the station and took me to where they were renting in London. And others that I knew that were discharged around the same time, we all ended up in the one spot and ended up getting a flat in Earl's Court together and then started applying for jobs, but not telling anyone why we'd left the Air Force.
That must have been an awkward thing to have to try and explain. You said you didn't even mention it to your parents. How did you explain that sudden change of career?
I just said I'd bought myself out. It wasn't for me. Yeah. So I lied. Yeah. I just said I'd purchased my discharge.
So did you ever tell your parents what happened?
Oh, yeah. I
Hmm.
told Mum. I never told Dad.
Hmm.
Mum understood and thought it was awful that had happened.
Hmm.
Dad, up until his dying day, couldn't understand why I wasn't married. So it wasn't going to happen there. Yeah, but Mum was, I guess, yeah, just distressed for me that I'd had to go through that. And I didn't tell her for quite some time after that.
Hmm.
It must have been comforting, I suppose, in a strange way to be with a group of people who had been through the same thing. I imagine you were a great support for one another.
Absolutely. I can't imagine what it would have been like if they hadn't been in my life. To face that on my own, I wouldn't even want to go there. I could only think I would have to have found, I probably would have gone home to Scotland.
And Debbie, when you found this information, or when one of your friends passed on the information about this new scheme to offer apologies and compensation, what did that trigger for you so many years later?
Yeah, I just wonder why it taken them so long. Um, but also, yeah, well, it obviously takes you back because, as you know, when you bring the past into the present, it becomes the present. So certainly the impact wasn't as bad, but it was certainly a bit of anger to be reminded of that, and it need never have happened. Um, and sure, I understand the culture then because, nobody came out willingly in those days. But it also got me thinking about how far we've come.
And do you feel, Debbie, what they're offering in terms of the compensation helps to repair some of that harm that's been caused to you?
No, I don't know if you can put a price on that. Yeah, my ambition to be, if you like, a top athlete was suddenly, well, it just wasn't as possible. When I was at school, I'd run for Scotland in the 4x100 meters relay. So, and I think the reason I got accepted as a physical training instructor was because of what I'd achieved at that point. So all of that kind of went when you find yourself in a big city. And yeah, certainly the last thing on my mind was to find an athletics club to join.
Yeah, you didn't just lose your job, did you? You lost kind of your dreams of.
Yeah, dreams and your identity, who you are. And I think that's why I reckon without the other people, those people that, you know, Pat, who sent me the text and said, "Did you know?" and who were there at the time and we were there for one another, what a difference that made. So certainly if anything comes to mind now, it's the realization of the impact of those friendships.
Do you still have contact with some of those people?
Yeah, yeah,
Nice.
yeah. Most of them.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. That's great. We spoke at the start about understanding the impact, from both parties' perspectives. And I wonder how much the forces want to understand, because obviously the compensation's helpful and the identity. Are they interested in hearing what impact it had on people? Or have they gone through a process of that? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, we went through the application today just to find out. what it says. And yeah, they do want to know the impact. And there's various levels as well, you know. So it
Mm.
would seem that some people were outed and stayed in. I don't know under what circumstances, but that's one of the levels, the dishonourable discharge and the interrogation. So there is an opportunity to write my story if I choose to go ahead and submit an application. So yeah, I will be, and they've asked for the impact as well.
How are you going to balance that kind of re-traumatizing yourself by having to go through it all versus the catharticness of maybe having an opportunity to tell your story?
I think it can be very therapeutic when you write stuff down. I talk a lot about journaling and getting stuff out your head, and even looking at, you know, thinking about today and writing some stuff down. That's been helpful. You know, I don't think putting in a submission is going to re-trigger the trauma in any way. I think it's going to be therapeutic.
I hear really strongly that it's not the money though that's making the difference here. It's the recognition and the asking for your story and being heard and recognized, and having the injustice of the situation recognized. It's much more important to you than any financial compensation.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, it's wonder why it took them so long, but they may have been beavering away at this for quite some time. Who knows?
I'm sure the
Um,
financial compensation would have been much more useful at the time when I remember you saying you had to leave your car behind and then having to get new accommodation and
yeah,
find a new job without having that history on your CV. That's probably the time when you really suffered financially, not 50 years later when you rebuild your life into a successful career.
yeah, but yeah, you never know. There's always some good stuff you can do. I mean, I don't know how much I'll end up getting, if anything, but who knows? But I think I will put in a submission simply because they should know what was done and the impact of it. And Scott, you've been talking about taking responsibility. You know, this is one way they can do that.
Hmm. What do you feel has been something you've learned or
Mm.
insight or growth or even used in your conflict resolution practices these days? Is there anything that really stands out as a learning?
Yeah, I think one having support, but two being able to talk about what's happened. And you know, as mediators, we're always saying, "Have you talked to the other person?" But I remember running a series of workshops called "Let's Talk About It." I think, yeah, just being able to tell your story and have others hear it, but also acknowledging that you're not alone. I wasn't the only one was helpful. And certainly I think moving into and looking at workplace bullying when somebody thinks that they've been unfairly treated, how do they get a voice? You know, I do quite a bit of what I call pro bono advocacy for people who have been stood down at work for whatever reason, because I'm always aware that they never really get a good chance to tell their story. Fight daily around when organizations talk about doing investigations. There's no justice in investigations. It's divisive. It isn't helpful for anyone. And that's why I keep pushing mediation. So, yeah, I would think I learned a lot at the time. I couldn't have said anything around what did I learn. I was still too, excuse me, pissed off to be thinking this is a great learning. Oh, I wish that maybe there's another one around the corner. No, I don't think so.
And I guess at that time, given, the social circumstances of the time, it wasn't easy to talk about what happened. You said you couldn't even talk to your parents about it at the time. So that would have also made it much more difficult for you to do that reflective process and learn and move on, because you had to kind of keep it inside or with your close-knit group of friends who'd been through the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. And it also was about what are we going to do now? Because we had no control, no power in terms of trying to find a remedy or challenge it or appeal it. That was it. It was here today, gone tomorrow, basically. So it was about, what are we going to do? We need somewhere to live. We got to find jobs. Yeah. And we were all in the same situation around, we didn't want to tell our folks.
Yeah. Debbie, if you had some advice to give to somebody, a young person today who's in a situation where they're potentially at the mercy of an organisation that might have unfair policies for some reason, what would your advice be from your experience?
Well, I know there was nothing around at that time, but finding an organisation that might provide some advocacy, depending on the context. So if you were in Tassie and it was a similar thing, you could go to working it out. But also using the systems, getting support and using the systems that are there, if you can, to have a voice and to challenge the injustice of it.
And also, I hear very strongly finding people who have been through similar experiences to give you that lived experience support was invaluable.
Yeah. And I think too, when, if we look at the themes and connecting the dots, setting up the Bullied Workers Support Action Network perhaps wasn't quite so accidental, because certainly it gave people strength to take action rather than feeling sorry and being in that victim space.
Feeling empowered to be heard, but also to do something.
Yeah, which that group did, which was amazing, the things they did.
And I mean, you probably had that strong sense of social justice already, but that experience has certainly laid a solid foundation of that throughout all the work that you're doing since.
Yeah, I think you're right. And often we don't think about it in those ways, do we? And yet I do reflective practice with social workers and other counsellors and people working in the not-for-profit sector. And that's one of the things I always ask about the history, why this work, and, what are the contributions that you make because of that history to the work? So, yeah, I think we often we're so busy we don't take time to reflect on how did I get here? Why here and not somewhere else? It's a bit too like my partner Tracy and I had a bit of a chat when we saw the thing on the financial settlement and really questioning, I mean, if I hadn't been dishonourably discharged, well, it's possible I would have stayed in. I'll tell you what, it's a great life. And I wouldn't have been in Australia. Possibly not. So, you never know where these things take you. Would I have been sitting here in Urbina overlooking Storm Bay talking to you if I hadn't been dishonourably discharged?
Silver linings there, Debbie. I love your optimism.
There's a little article I wrote recently about the scar and the wound, and when we've gone through some traumatic incident and we've learned and it's healed, we can share that wisdom with others. And that's
Yes.
what it feels like you've done too, Debbie, with setting up especially that bullying group to feel more empowered.
Yeah, and being able to talk with you now. Good heavens. Yeah, what a privilege, what an honour, what an opportunity.
Debbie, we usually end up our episodes by asking our guest for a pearl of wisdom, something to do with conflict that you could share with the audience.
I've got several NDIS clients, and one in particular, one I always talk about because she has an acquired brain injury. And we talk a lot about the brain and how it works, only doing things that bring you joy. And I think that should apply to work as well. I get a lot of joy out of what I do. And sure, you can follow your dreams, but if you're doing things that bring you joy, they'll take you to your dreams anyway.
That's lovely.
I think you've given us really interesting, informative, challenging stories that you've been through, and it's been really great to have you on, Debbie. So thank you for your time and your wisdom.
And thanks so much for sharing the personal side of what happened in the Air Force. When we first arranged to interview you, we were really talking about narrative mediation and bullying, and then sort of serendipitously, the redress scheme popped up, and then your previous experience came to light, and we thought it would be great to talk about that too. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure our audience will get a lot from hearing what happened to you and how you managed it.
No, thank you both, and nice to meet you, Scott. Heard so much about you.
You
All
too.
good to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Well, Debbie, keep on, as we say on Conflict Stories, working towards a more peaceful future.
And enjoy your conflict.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.
See ya.